Hey, so I am Kurt Nelson, and I work at Pinterest on the platform team. And I'm here to talk about observability of applications in production. So how many of you all how many of you all have shipped something to, in the thousands of users at least on the Play Store? I'm assuming most of you, or, yeah. So this is definitely meant as a slightly beginner talk, or for maybe you want to start over and do it again in a different way. And so we're going to talk about, okay, so what is observability? When should I care about observability? When should I set it up? And then, of course, how do you actually do it? And then I'm going to throw in the now what do we do with all this stuff once we have this data coming through? So observability is the ability to see what is happening in production on user devices with your binary. And as mobile developers, we're always in a slightly different world than server developers in that we are not in a white box situation where we're running the binary on our own hardware or devices in a data center. We're out there in the wild on random people's phones, and we don't have root, we don't have logs. So it's up to you as a developer to decide what you want to get off that device. And so some of those things that you might want to observe, or the types of observability you have, are in unstructured logging, which is just traditional logcats or text. Crash reporting is a form of observability. Your performance metrics and then analytics are part of this package. And this is all very in backend, it's kind of assumed that you have all this out of the box. And my opinion is that as soon as an app is out in the public and in the wild, it should at least have some form of this stuff installed. You want this because you can't, once the binary is out there, you can't necessarily update it quickly like you can with the server binary. And you also want this all because even if you have a manual QA process, I've seen especially in consulting work where they're like, oh, we'll just run it through this manual QA process and they'll catch everything. Of course, that is not how it works in the real world out there. And I mean, basically this is a Firebase pitch deck at the end of the day, is use what Google gives you. It's free, it works, it gets you off the ground running. And a lot of companies out there do tend to roll their own things. There are vendors, of course, for this, but at a minimum, like from day one, launch Firebase, configure it, and you can kind of figure out what else you need later. At a minimum, get the data flowing so that you can go search for it at a future point. So yeah, the bread and butter of observability would be kind of three common things that I think every single app out there should do and have implemented. And so traditional logging, of course, so you have your logcats probably already in your code. But the traditional logging would include non-fatal stack traces, logging anytime you have that code that says with a comment of this should not happen, or you swallow an exception. You should probably log that at least in an unstructured logging way, so that when you have crashes later, you can see, oh, the thing that I said would never happen did happen. That's clearly what went wrong. You need your crash reporting. That is honestly like the most important thing, and I've seen way too many people be like, oh, I forgot to install a crash reporting library, I guess I'll use Google Play. Well, once the binary's out there, you can't necessarily get it updated. And and something I'm going to kind of talk about over and over is structured versus unstructured logging, and how they both are two different sides of the observability coin. And crash reporting is just a very specific type of structured logging. A structured log is essentially a schema versus just text. And so a crash report is just a very specific type of log, and it can be treated as such. It's a log that probably has a stack trace, maybe some state with it. And a good system that is implemented well on the back end will take your structured crash reports and your unstructured other logs and cluster them together. And also ideally, these days they'll have some sort of AI even that will be like, hey, all these crashes have this unstructured log in common of the logcat saying this should never happen happening. And yeah, and metadata should be attached to your crash reports. And that's another thing that I have seen too many times where you maybe don't know what specific binary or commit the crash is from. And I mean, there are version codes, but depending on how your Git history is set up, it may be a pain to figure out, oh, that version code means at this exact commit. And when you need to go in and reproduce and debug, it's very nice to know, oh, I just check out this exact commit and build there and can reproduce it. And then, yeah, the general catch-all of just structured logging of other types besides just crashes would be your performance data, your analytic events, and often ad impressions are just essentially a fancy log. And yeah, structured logging is something that I think backend engineers just kind of take for granted as a thing, is they might actually have a enum of a bunch of event types and then fields on that enum, and then on mobile, a lot of times we just say, oh, we're just gonna logcat some text. And performance data, analytic events, all this it all rolls in together, and it's useful to see that whole picture all at once. And so yeah, so structured logging in the Kotlin world is very nice because you can probably use a data class, and you can say we have our log event data class, and whatever types you need, you can put in that data class. So you could have your handled crash. So you could see an exception, and you could have a specific Kotlin data class you emit when that happens, or even seeing your server errors as a data class sent across the wire can be very nice. And the structured logging, part of the point of it is that machines can consume it. And so you can write a query that can group across your structured logs, and you can do analytics and query on that, whereas an unstructured log is a lot harder to query upon. So if you just have a wall of text, maybe your best choice is grep, or more text analytic type of things, and that's not terribly useful when you're in a fire and something's falling over and you're having to figure out how to query for it. So, and yeah, the cats are, so that's the log cat right there. So yet another log cat. So do any of you all use structured logging outside of the basic Firebase? Anyone have anything besides like ad impressions or any type of structured logs? No?
This is all server logs, right? Not the device.
No, from the device. Yeah, so are you sending any are you sending any logs from the device that are more than just a crash report? Like what?
For latency measurements.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things where like a lot of us think of the very standard thing of crash reporting. And ad impressions, I think, are a big one where if you're an ad company and your ad impressions are a structured log, and it's important that they get to the server, but maybe not in a rush or they don't need to hit the server necessarily within 10 seconds of the impression happening. They need to be eventually consistent. And so structured logs are often eventually consistent. They don't necessarily need to be real time, and that's part of the advantage. But then, yeah, unstructured data is better than having no data. So if you have events happening on your device, it's always better to shove them up to the server or to cloud somewhere so that you can go triage them later versus not having them at all. And I know one example where this has gotten me in the past is where you're using a third-party SDK, such as Google Maps, and you just kind of fire off Google Maps and hope it works. And then maybe if you'd say, oh, Google Maps is going to always work. It's always going to launch. And we had a case where Google pushed a Play Services update that took down Maps it was a wide outage across Uber and a couple other big companies where we just had no visibility into what was happening because we were like, oh yeah, Google has that, right? And so if we had logcats from those devices, we would have been able to see, but of course I don't have a USB cord into some random person's phone in India in this case. So we were kind of going blind. And so we had no data at all. And so one of the things we did as part of that outage is we went in and tried to instrument, we did some hacky stuff, but we were able to kind of capture the exception handler and forward over to us anything that Google was trying to send to themselves in their SDK. So once you have your data flowing, The process and what you do with that in case of an outage really is kind of an iterative thing. You don't need to have from day one like, okay, so in the case of an outage, you go to this server and you look at these logs, you parse it this way, you run this query. That kind of is just something that happens as you have outages and as you go through that incident management. And so it's more important that you have that data flowing into your system so that when you do have the incident, you can have something to work with. And eventually, you will probably end up with a process where you say, okay, in the case of an incident, or we are seeing that these metrics are down, you're like, oh, I'm going to go look in this specific spot first, and you can have a run book based on whatever structured or unstructured logs you have. So you might have some queries pre-written to go across your structured logs and allow you to kind of quickly diagnose where in your stack the issue is, or even is it the mobile app, is it the back end, where, like why are we seeing all of a sudden no ad impressions coming in? And that's part of like having a nice SRE runbook, a service reliability engineer is having engineers who are good at kind of going through the weeds that you have and figuring out what's actually going on. So beyond the basics, once you have your basics flowing into your back end, you can then build on top of that to further improve your service. And so the two things that are definitely useful in firefighting are experimentation and alerting. So experimentation, you of course need the data to experiment upon. So if I am launching something new and I don't know, is it going to improve the metrics? Is it going to actually make the user experience better? That's what an experiment is for. So you're like, I know this behavior is changing, but I don't know how it's going to change. And so you can set up experimentation based on your data flowing in and say, okay, if these metrics move this way, we're going to keep rolling this feature out. But if we see a sudden drop, we stop rolling the feature out. Then alerting, of course, is the kind of very important for incident management is hopefully you can catch something before it causes an actual outage. And having good alerting in place based on your logs, so even if it's a lack of logs, for example, might be an alert that something went wrong. It's always bad to hear about, like from a Play Store review or on Twitter, that your app is broken, because that's kind of the worst. And things are going to go wrong, and alerting is good for knowing, like, I don't know what can break, but please let me know, system, if something did break, and then you can kind of fix it later. Then having feature flags, or as back-end people tend to call it, circuit breakers, so that when something is broken, you can actually shut it off or stop the failure or stop the retries. Because if you know your whole app's broken, for example, if the backend's down, the whole entire backend might be down due to some server farm outage. Being able to have your app say, hey, we know it's broken, we're on it, versus just sitting there and spinning or hanging is a very nice feature to have. And and of course you need logs or some form of data to tell you, oh, okay, this thing is broken. We are going to show this different screen saying, hey, our backend's down, we haven't seen anything from it. Here's a different experience. And Uber, we had a project called Black Swan where we tried to recover or at least degrade gracefully. So it could go anywhere from clearing the user data to launching a web view with a web mobile version of the app. And we had a flag we could push out. And when we saw stuff was going wrong, we could kind of gracefully degrade over to a web view when we know something has gone really, really wrong. So when in your process should you implement your observability? And I definitely would say you don't need to worry about it if you're in the prototyping phase or haven't shipped to customers or you're building a new feature that's internal only. It's kind of not necessarily the top of your mind. Also, you may not want that data flowing yet. If you have an app out there and you're building a new feature and it's employees only, you probably don't want that data kind of polluting your general production data. And in a back-end context, generally in a microservice architecture, all this stuff comes out of the box. So if you're using something like Docker or any container-based thing, there's often a sidecar that you say, okay, this is now in production, load in all this stuff, and it handles piping everything into whatever your logging or crash reporting system is. And if you have microservices, you might have hundreds of these services, so of course it's not kind of expected that every time you configure all this. But with mobile, it's generally, you have your one mobile app. So you have to kind of think about this and do it yourself. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And as mobile developers, we generally own this. There's not, even if you're a big company, a relatively big company, and you are the mobile app owner, you probably have to do all this yourself. Whereas you might have a whole infrastructure team for your server farm who handles all this plumbing for you. And so yeah, that's kind of the choice there is like, when do you want to implement this stuff? When do you want to plug it in? Kind of up to you as a app owner. But at a minimum, you do get Google Play Console Vitals out of the box. So this is the stuff that is in Google Play. And this can be useful for business stakeholders, I've found over the years, is you can often point them at your Play console and it's very understandable by them. But it's not necessarily good for engineering purposes. It is observability, but not at the granularity that is useful for an engineer. But it does at least get you the most glaring of performance issues get flagged. So I forget how many ANRs have to happen before it shows up in the Play console, but it's a significant number. Whereas if you have your own stuff rolled in, you maybe can catch it earlier. But at a minimum, it does get you somewhere. It gets you off the ground with some data flowing. So when do you need more? So as you're doing your development process and you maybe have your Play Store Vitals or your SDK out of the box, when do you decide, okay, I want to start adding more analytics events or more crash reporting? And I would say a lot of it is communicating with your business stakeholders what you are able to see. So it's really unfortunate when a product owner is like, hey, so what happened? How many users are going into this screen and then doing this thing? And you're like, well, I didn't build that in. I can't tell you. So as part of the product development, product engineering cycle is saying, hey, what do you as a product owner or feature owner want to know the users are doing? And just communicating this out front of like, it's kind of a question I commonly ask is like, okay, so what is the end result here? What do you want to know is happening versus kind of just implementing it and then chucking it over the wall and hoping it works. And yeah, you should align with whatever their success criteria is. So as an engineer, you may not know what the business success criteria is, but you should be able to ask that and say, hey, what is your success criteria so that you can measure it and present it to them at the end of the experiment or the quarter or whatever your process is. So how can you implement observability best? And honestly, Firebase is my favorite thing I've used over the years. A lot of places hand roll things in-house or whatnot, but at a minimum, Firebase gets you off the ground running. It's free. And the three parts I always set up are Crashlytics, performance monitoring, and the analytics package. And these are like kind of, anytime I'm standing up a new app, I always install these. The rest of Firebase is nice, but these are like kind of I want on day one. And what's cool and kind of something that a lot of people don't realize is that with Firebase, you can check a checkbox and it'll send it all over to BigQuery, which is the Google Cloud Platform's scalable database. And so this is actually the schema you can get and query against if you're already using Firebase Crashlytics. So even if you haven't turned this on from day one, you can go in and tick a box, and it might take an hour or two to populate, but you can then query against all this data here. So even if you don't have some fancy dashboard, or once again, you don't know yet what you need to know, you can say, oh, okay, what's happening? Are crashes up in this country or this area? Or maybe a selection of countries or a region, for example. And this is very helpful when you're a company like Uber that was in very different geographic markets. Is like, okay, what's going on in Asia right now? Holidays are different in different countries, and so you could segment and do your own dashboarding on like, okay, so New Year's Eve in the US might behave very differently than Diwali in India, and being able to dashboard it and kind of alert separately. And so, trying to think if any of these fields are particularly useful that I've used in the past. Yeah, it's all just stuff that's there once again, and you probably don't know you need it until you need it. And if you didn't set it up in the first place, you don't have it. So the other thing that you can dump is your Google Analytics data into BigQuery. And it's a similar thing. You can have all this data on every event. And that you can kind of abuse Google Analytics and Firebase in a good way, and that you can put whatever you want in these events. You can put a whole bundle in You can put basically anything that fits in a bundle into your event. So you can use this as like a poor man's ad impression system even, for example. So you could say, okay, I want to build my customers based on how many people see the screen with their product on it. Well, you could just drop an analytics event, set up a Google Cloud Platform pipeline on a query, and manually write them an invoice to start with. It's good for prototyping. And then also you can correlate it with crashes. So you could say, okay, well, I want to look at this analytics event, but exclude people who crashed when this event happened, because maybe you don't want to bill in that case. And this is all, once again, out of the box. All you have to do is initialize the SDK in the first place, and then you can do all this stuff later, even years later. It's all in the cloud already, and it's dirt cheap, because this, as far as storing this type of data goes, it's often maybe $1 a month for all your data for years of app usage. So that's kind of my Firebase overview as far as like the basics of observability off the ground. Some things that I like using also. So Bugsnag is definitely a step up from Crashlytics. It gives you a lot more data. You can tie it in with your build system. David, for example, my coworker right here, we have a way where our builds show up in Bugsnag, so you can see, okay, on this bug, here's the commit hash that this build was at, and you can link into your integration testing or whatever from Bugsnag. It's I don't know the cost on it. It's not exactly cheap, but it's not. It doesn't break the bank either. Mobile.dev, who are outside actually, one of my former coworkers, Leland. So they do a lot of this stuff, but for performance. So you can write these scripted tests that will walk through your app, tap buttons, and then they log all that performance data and graph it for you. And once again, that's not like, it's not something you need on day one, but if you care about performance and certain flows, it's nice to get that data flowing so you can see, oh, well, we just pushed a new release, and now this flow is slow, and then you can look at your analytics data and join it all together to figure out what's going on. Jaeger is a tool from Uber, and Google has something similar to it too, where it's end-to-end tracing. So, okay, you have your crash or whatever on your device, but maybe it was due to something happening on the back end. With something like Jaeger, you have an ID that goes through the whole query all the way to the database and back. So you can see from mobile to your, through your backend code to your database and back, the whole life cycle of the request. And once again, you dump that into your data lake, and you can then correlate it with your analytics and say, okay, so why are these people not spending money? Well, maybe their traces are slow or something like that. And I would say, yeah, big tech likes to kind of do these things from scratch in-house. Google doesn't use Firebase, which is kind of makes sense. Google has all this written from scratch in-house, including their own client-side libraries. There's almost no reason to do that unless you are a Google or a Facebook or whatever. A lot of those companies like to do it because they want to keep their data to themselves. But I don't think any of that's a good reason for anyone who's not one of the top 5 companies. So like most companies should be paying a vendor for this stuff because it is not their mission critical. It's not part of the business domain. So you get all this hooked up. Now what? So you've got your Bugsnag set up, you got your performance traces, your analytics all in place. And then honestly, it comes down to once it's set up, ideally you just let it go and you can relax. And if something goes wrong, you are equipped and you're ready to go. You can firefight it without everything falling over on you at the same time. And of course, it's nice is, can you just avoid outages in the first place? And that's a kind of a future endeavor that your organization can go on is, okay, so we got all our stuff running, we have product market fit, we know what our app's doing, now can we start dodging outages before they even happen? And that's where stuff like experimentation and feature flags come in. So Google came up with SRE to describe how backend engineers are basically operating on code and, are treating operations as code. So their job is to engineer away manual processes or to automate things. And the Google SRE book, which is sre.google/SRE book, if you've not seen that before, it's a relatively long document, but it's useful to kind of get a mindset on this stuff. And in the case of mobile, the service that you are supporting in this case is the app. So we can kind of steal the best practices from backend and apply them to our apps. And once you get your observability and logging in place, you can then try and alert when things get strange but still seem to work, so that, as I said earlier, you can kind of head things off before they go wrong. And then you can start guarding your changes based on your the expected behavior. So if things start behaving strangely, maybe you can correlate it to a change you did, a code push, something of that nature. And I know I'm in the last slot and everyone's tired, but that's kind of the summary of observability.